I walked.
Still trying to figure it out. I know this is new to me too. How are you?
Good, thank you. I think we're
Good.
live. Let's
Yeah,
just give it 1 more minute and then we'll kick off.
perfect. Things are still. Hold on.
Okay.
I don't know what's going on here. There we go.
Can you still hear me? I'm using my
Yeah,
AirPods now.
yeah, I can.
Okay.
I
Fantastic.
can.
But it's 11:30 on your end and 12:30 here, so I think we'll
Hmm.
start.
Okay.
Hello, hello everyone. I'm Dr. Tolu Alugo from St. John Cap. So today we're going to be having a special guest with us. Over the last few weeks, we've been talking about all things ADHD, what causes it, well, not, I mean, what it is, what it is not, common symptoms of ADHD, strategies at home, and so on. So we still have another couple of weeks of discussing ADHD, but I thought today we'll talk about one particular area that's not just not just specific to ADHD, but would be relevant to everybody. But specifically, can be a big problem with ADHD, and that is sleep. So today I have a special guest, Dr. Cara Ooi. I'm going to get you to tell us a bit about yourself, where you're from, what you do, and then we can kick off our discussion. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me. So my name is Dr. Cara Ooi, and I'm also a child and youth psychiatrist working out of Toronto, Canada. However, after I did my training in child and adolescent psychiatry, I went on and I did a fellowship in sleep medicine. And in particular, so I do general sleep medicine, but I have a particular interest in working with teens and young adults who have insomnia. And so I do a particular type of treatment called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. And I've really taken those strategies and have tried to adapt them to fit the needs of the age group that I work with, because they have very specific challenges that make it, I think, difficult for them to really benefit from the traditional approach. So in terms of, you asked me another question, and I'm not sure remember what that last
No,
one.
just what you do, where you're based. I think you've answered
Sure. Yeah.
that question.
Yeah.
Great. So you mentioned that you see a particular age group. What age group do you see in your practice, in your sleep practice?
Focusing on the 13 to 26-year-olds. Actually, for quite some time, it's really just been the 13 to 18-year-olds, because that age group is quite unique. Obviously, still living at home most of the time. And the adolescent years, as we know, are a time of a lot of change, and oftentimes a lot of conflict can arise around the fact that during that time, teens are becoming more independent. And so there's an interesting dynamic that can get set up with parents, and that really does tend to come out a lot around sleep.
Okay. So before we go into talking about sleep in general, just to be sure I have my terminology right, is there a difference between sleep difficulties and insomnia, or is it just like a spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, sleep difficulties, I think we could refer to as being any type of difficulties with sleep. When we're talking about insomnia as a diagnosis, we're often talking about chronic insomnia. So that does require a certain number of days per week and a certain duration of time. And, with insomnia, obviously, we're referring to difficulties initiating sleep or maintaining sleep. And then also there being that functional impact. So I think when we refer to insomnia, that's maybe a bit more of a catch-all term, but then we also have a diagnosis of chronic insomnia disorder.
Okay. So I'm wondering, in your practice, what kind of general sleep problems are you seeing in this 13 to 26-year age group?
Well, so I mean, because I'm a sleep physician, I see the whole gamut of different sleep issues. So I may see some sleep apnea, I do see some parasomnia disorders, things like narcolepsy or other disorders of excessive sleepiness or hypersomnolence. But really, the vast majority of the presentations in this age group are a combination of insomnia. Oftentimes, there's sleep timing issues, so issues of the timing of the body clock. And then the third one I would say is inadequate sleep, which is different from insomnia. It more has to do with the lack of opportunity to get enough sleep,
Okay.
as opposed to the ability to fall asleep or stay asleep.
Right. I guess in my own practice, because I'm seeing mental health disorders, I'm seeing a lot of people coming in with sleep difficulties associated with their mental health disorders. But also in general conversations with friends and family, I think sleep is a huge problem. I mean, so what are the implications? Is it a big deal when people can't get sleep? for example?
Absolutely. And I mean, I think with everything there's a range, right? So I think there are a lot of people who are chronically sleep deprived but functioning fine, maybe not functioning at their optimal level. But then there are people at the other end of the spectrum, teens and adults alike, who really sleep is a complete barrier to, anywhere from, for example, being able to wake up to attend school or wake up to attend appointments. The way in which sleep can, or the lack of sleep or lack of good sleep can impact us. We all know, what that's like when we haven't slept well, just how much that can impact our ability to perform, our ability to think, our ability to regulate our emotions. It covers everything, right? So there's just such a wide ranging, and so many different things that can be impacted by poor sleep.
Yeah, I can imagine if I haven't had a good night's sleep, the next day I'm like a zombie. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
just wondering, obviously that would be the case for many people as well. But what are the usual causes of difficulty, particularly in teens? What are you noticing?
The, tip,
Um,
the typical
you know,
difficulties in teens.
yeah, I mean the typical factors that would contribute to poor sleep.
Okay, so I mean, there are so many factors that that contribute to sleep issues in the teen years. I think there are the ones that we all have. So teens and adults, I always say to people that we live in a world that's just really not set up to sleep well these days. So I think we need to consider obviously electronics and devices and just how much being online is ingrained into how we live our lives. And on top of that, I always talk about how it's really not a very fair situation. There's so much money invested in terms of keeping us online, right? It's very, very addictive to be online, because oftentimes it's fun and enjoyable. There's always something to look at. And it's also, especially now during the pandemic, the way that we stay connected to other people. So I think it's really difficult, for anybody to really be able to step away from the devices. But in the teen years, it's that much more difficult because connection is is especially important in the teen years, connection with
Yeah.
peers. And also, I think at in the teen years, we have to remember just where they're at in that stage in their lives. Oftentimes their prefrontal cortex hasn't fully developed, and so things like being able to put things down in the moment because that will help them in the future. That's not really what we can expect of most teens at this point, right? That's very expected behavior. So I think that combined with just the world we live in and how much devices are difficult to step away from, period, really creates part of that perfect storm. And then there's all the other things, right? So we live in a pretty stressful world. There's constant inputs, constantly things to keep us alert and on, making it difficult to power down. And then there is for the teen years, one of the really tricky things is that their body clocks tend to run later. So if, for example, when they were kids, they wanted to go to bed at maybe 9 or maybe 9 p.m., there's a natural delay around puberty of about 2 hours. So it's very common, just a baseline, forgetting electronics, forgetting everything else, that most teens typically don't want to go to sleep until maybe 11 or 12, and then maybe don't want to wake up until 9 a.m. But of course, you probably know many teens who are on an even later schedule, and that's because all of the electronics and all the light, all of that can really push the clock later. So I saw a lot of that, and I'm sure you did too during the pandemic.
Mm.
That many teens were just completely flipped around, and they were sleeping, entirely during the day and up all night. It's very easy to do that. So that's
Mm.
another big one. I can keep on going. Do you want me to keep?
Well, I mean, I'll just
Like,
interrupt here. You mentioned the issue of the lights from devices. How does that affect our sleep?
so the light it impacts melatonin production. So melatonin, ideally would be rising maybe around 7-ish p.m. And that's in response to a reduction in light. So if we kind of extract ourselves from modern day life and you think about what happens with natural light and dark cues, it starts to get dark around then. That then triggers production of melatonin, but light, and in particular the blue spectrum light, suppresses production of that. So light is something that makes it hard to get sleepy, and also can actually delay the timing of the clock. So the timing of when we get light and dark cues has an impact on the timing of the clock. And that's how the clock essentially kind of knows to shift.
Right. And so all
Mm-hmm.
the light on our phones, our iPads just confuses our brain essentially, is what
Yeah,
I'm hearing you say, right?
yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
So I know you don't see the younger age group, but I'm just wondering if you could speak to the possible causes of sleep difficulties in the younger kids.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's kind of all the same
Mm,
stuff, right? I mean, I think in the younger years, you don't have typically that later running body clock, and so in some ways that is a bit easier. Kids naturally, their kind of the timing of their circadian rhythm does tend to match up better with the natural rhythm of life, right? Going to school and things like that. They don't have that mismatch that the teens have. But it's all the same stuff, right? It's all the same stuff that keeps kids from being able to wind down. You know, I have a framework actually that I'll go through with my patients, but anywhere from environmental factors, of course, things like stress and anxiety play a big role. I know we're talking about ADHD today, so
mm,
I can certainly comment on that, but oftentimes individuals or kids who have ADHD, often just they're sitting at a baseline where they are more hyperactive and they do tend to have busier minds. And that makes it that much more difficult to wind down at the right time. I think a lot of individuals who have ADHD also require more to kind of come down, right? It may take them longer. Some people can do that quite quickly, but I've found that in a lot of individuals that I see with ADHD, they need more time, or they need more strategies. They need more tools to be able to know how to do that. So I think that's another thing definitely that can contribute.
yeah, because I know a lot of the kids I see with ADHD is almost every mother is complaining that their kids just cannot fall asleep, and so they're up till,
Mm.
if bedtime is 7 o'clock, they start early, but still 9 p.m., 10 p.m., they're
Yeah,
still wide awake, and so
yeah.
that's a concern. So, in terms of general principles, what kind of strategies would help, you know, to manage for everybody that's relevant to the general population?
Hmm. So, at this point, I really could give you a very long, I'm going to try to not do that because I think that can be overwhelming. And I found this in my practice that I used to do that. I used to kind of give out essentially the equivalent of, the sleep hygiene handout, which is all good advice, but it's very difficult, I think, especially, well, for my teens who are very tired to know what to target first and what's going to, be best to start with. But I think also probably there's a similar experience for parents too, right? Parents are very busy. They are caught up in the whirlwind of their own lives, and knowing where to start and being able to do things consistently, which is often the case, or often what's needed to sleep well, is very tricky. So um, in terms of where to start, I typically always get people to start in the same few places or the same three steps. So the first thing that I typically do is, I recommend that people take a look at the environment, and in particular the light, because that's such a big one, as I mentioned, that contributes to difficulties with being able to wind down, and also with that shifting of the clock. And one thing I forgot to mention earlier is that although younger kids do tend to have a clock that runs on an earlier schedule, or a schedule that's more conducive to kind of a regular schedule, um, kids with ADHD do tend to run a bit later, and they're a bit more likely to run later too. So they may have more of that teen pattern even in the younger years, and you'll see that. You'll see some kids that are just night owls, and kids who have ADHD do have more of that tendency. So the light is really key, because if you don't control the light, it makes it very difficult to wind down. And if you've got a kid who's more of a night owl and you don't control the light situation, you can't really expect them to sleep earlier, right? The body's just not ready for sleep yet. So I have a lot of tips around how to make changes to the light situation. Essentially, what you're wanting to do is you're wanting to start reducing light 3 to 5 hours before bedtime, right? Which is a really large window. It doesn't mean you're sitting in the dark for that entire time, but there are a number of different ways that you can just start to reduce the amount of light. And I actually have a jumpstart kit on my website that people can take a look at, just with a bunch of different ideas. There's some products that can be quite helpful. Even if you're wanting to go to the extreme, things like blue light blocking glasses, but lots of other things like little amber tinted lights that I use with my own kids, and I also use for myself. Just making sure that you're turning off unnecessary lights. I think we're often not aware of just how much light we're getting in the evening. And in particular, I always mention to people that the LED lights have a lot of that harmful light. So just turning those off, if you can dim lights, if you can turn down the brightness of the screen, if people are watching TV, filters on all the devices. These are all things that can make a real difference, and they don't require too much energy, which is nice. It's a nice place to start. So the light is important, and I'll also mention on the flip side of not wanting a lot of light in the evening, you actually want a lot of light in the morning, That helps with anchoring the clock. That also helps with a lot of other things, with alertness and mood as well. But light in the morning is also really important. Another thing it can do actually is light in the morning can help with counteracting some of the impact of light in the evening. So that's a big one. Blackout conditions as much as possible overnight too is another piece of that. The other piece that I will typically have people start with is based on this idea, another very powerful factor that drives insomnia and sleep difficulties is that often because of a history of having spent a lot of time awake in bed, it's very common, or almost I'd say universal, for people with sleep difficulties to have developed an unhelpful relationship with their bed. So bed, instead of being paired with kind of sleep state or kind of on the edge of sleep, that kind of state, it's more paired with being alert and awake. Oftentimes it's paired with a certain degree of physical tension and anxiety and that overactive mind. This is an extremely common thing. If you start to kind of listen in, you'll hear people say things like, I was really tired and sleepy, and then I got into bed and all of a sudden my mind woke up, or I felt much better. And that is essentially kind of a manifestation of what I just described. So one of the most helpful strategies is to actually to retrain yourself to associate bed with that kind of sleepy state. And the way in which you do that is you cut out all the time awake in bed, and you're really not getting into bed until you're on the edge of sleep. That also means that if you cannot sleep and you've been in bed for 10, 15 minutes, you're getting out of bed and then really trying to not return into bed until you're on the edge of sleep. Same thing goes in the middle of the night. Same thing goes at the end of the night. So it's a really great strategy, but it's very, very difficult to do consistently. So the next step that I typically recommend for people is that you need to have somewhere else that you are realistically going to go in the moment. And so I talk about this concept of a cozy nook. So having somewhere for the teens I work with, somewhere in their room that they can really easily get to. So they're not having to maybe go all the way downstairs or somewhere where there's a lot of people, but it's a comfortable place that's not very stimulating, but they can go and they can do, when they can't sleep or during the day, because a lot of teens spend time in bed during the day. That can be where they hang out. That can be where they relax before getting into bed. So that's another big one. Part of that also is setting up stuff to do that is not electronics, because it's just so difficult otherwise to default to the behaviors that we already know and we already do. And then the last one is actually, and I should probably say this is often the first one that I start with, is just actually typically delaying the bedtime until you can actually expect sleep. So one of the common things that I see in teens, but I think this also happens in kids, it definitely happens in kids too, is that oftentimes teens are trying to sleep or getting into bed hours before their body's ready for sleep, either because of that body clock running later, or the other reason is that when we are awake, we build up drive for sleep. And it takes a certain amount of time, and you need to be active enough in order to have built up enough of that drive. So, for example, if you sleep in late on Saturday, or if you nap after school because you're really tired, what ends up happening is that you can't build up that drive or that sleepiness. And so you don't essentially have, you kind of think of it as almost like fuel or hunger for sleep. You don't have that. And so if you get into bed and you expect sleep before you have that, or before it's the time for your clock to sleep, you're just lying there and you get frustrated and you get anxious and you get bored because your body's just not ready for sleep. It's not actually an inability to fall asleep at that time, or rather an inability to wind down and fall asleep. It's more of the fact that your body's just not ready yet. And so it's a timing issue. So in teens, I often will get them to delay their bedtime. There's an equivalent strategy used in younger kids called bedtime fading, okay, which is essentially the same idea. You get parents to calculate, when the kids are actually falling asleep, and you are temporarily delaying the bedtime to that time, which helps with the buildup of the drive, right? So that they're sleepier when they're getting into bed. And also it's probably better matching up with maybe the timing of their clock. And it just helps with, all of the stuff that happens at bedtime, like coming out, checking and wanting water, or coming out, and right, all of those things that tend to happen for the younger kids at bedtime. So I would say those three things, kind of delaying the bedtime and timing it better with when they can actually expect sleep, setting up another place and encouraging them to not get into bed until they're sleepy, and then also addressing the light and dark environment or the signals, as I mentioned before.
Okay. Just to tell people who are on the call that you're able to type in a few questions, we might take three or maybe two or three questions at the end. I just forgot to say that at the beginning. Thank you. Those are such great tips. I had a couple of questions. So you mentioned the fading. I think that's very counterintuitive. For most of us as moms, we're thinking, you need to go to bed earlier. I don't care if you
Mhm.
can't sleep, just stay in bed. So
Yeah,
that's flipping things around for most moms.
it is.
Maybe let them stay up till they're actually ready to go to bed. That's a different way of doing things, I think.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think we can't ignore the fact that parents need time in the evening too. So it's very difficult, consistent. So that's why a few things that can be helpful are to not start this kind of haphazardly. You want to go in with a plan. It's a good idea to start this on a Friday when you're not going to be stressed out, for example, about having to work the next day. And really thinking of it as an event, right? A time limited kind of reset where you are going to be delaying the bedtime. You've got a plan for that time, right? Because you don't want the kids to be going onto their screens. So maybe you plan for to have some quiet board game time, or you have stuff ahead of time so that it's just more likely to be able to be consistent and sustain it for long enough for it to be helpful, because you're not going to see improvement right away, right? It's a process where you have to delay it for a certain amount of time. And then once they start, they're able to fall asleep more easily at that time, then you can very gradually move the bedtime earlier. So what I would really encourage people is, if they're listening to this idea of bedtime fading, I've kind of gone over the general principle, but I think it's actually quite helpful to know what the overall specific plan is. And I do actually have although I don't see the younger kids, I do have a handout on my website. So my website is decodeinsomnia.com. And if you go under the resources, and actually it's archived handouts because I don't use it anymore, but I do have a handout there for the school age kids. And I talk through the step-by-step of actually doing bedtime fading, and what you can expect, right? Because again, it's really important to set the expectation that this is not going to be helpful right away. Sometimes it is, right? Sometimes that first night they can fall asleep faster because you're delaying the bedtime, but sometimes it doesn't. It hasn't yet. It's not yet working, so you have to really stay the course before you can expect to see things improve.
And also, I'm worried about the summer months when it's light, the daylight hours are much longer. So, do you find that then kids are even staying up even later because their body clock just doesn't switch early enough because of the longer daytime hours in the
I
summer?
think I think it's probably a combination of a few different things. I mean, in the summer, oftentimes wake up times are not as early, right? Unless I guess there's camp. Sometimes it's the same, but oftentimes people will shift back a little bit. So, and I think in general, parents um, tend to become a bit more lax about bedtime. Um, I was just talking to my kids about that today. They were saying, "Wait, can we stay up later on in summer?" I said, "Yeah, probably, because then we have a bit more flexibility." So, yeah, I think it's probably a combination of those things.
Right. Okay.
Mm.
So thank you so much. I wanted you to talk about TV in the bedroom. Is that a good idea? Because I'm seeing more and more families having, I mean, even for adults having a TV in the bedroom. Does this make a difference to the sleep pattern?
Yeah, so no. I think the short answer would be no. It's not a good idea, for the light reason that I mentioned before,
Mm,
and the fact that light is activating. And although TV, I will say as a caveat, TV is better than a tablet or a phone or a laptop. The further away the source of light, actually, the less of an impact it has. TVs can still be problematic, and TVs are often very bright, and so you can do things like dim the screen, dim the backlighting. I will sometimes recommend a TV show, not in the bedroom, but a TV show as a harm reduction strategy. So it's not kind of the ideal, but it might be a better alternative. Um, but I think the other thing is just it's not just light, right? It's also the fact that when we're watching TV, we do need to stay, we're activated to a certain degree, right? We're stimulated to a certain degree. Some people will tell me that the TV actually helps them with drowning out certain thoughts, for example. It's very common actually watching Netflix to help drown out anxious thoughts that tend to show up at bedtime. And that makes a lot of sense on one hand, but there are alternatives. And so I always try to validate that, but also help people find non-screen alternatives so that they're not having to rely on something like, watching a show on Netflix or something like that.
Commonly, families with kids with ADHD would give them melatonin at bedtime. And how
Mhm.
often do you see that in your practice? And is it an effective way of managing sleep when other methods haven't worked? Does that help?
Yeah, so I mean, in general, the studies for melatonin are not they're not fantastic, right? I think melatonin is much more widely used than it should be, to be honest. However, there are some studies in kids with ADHD. So I think it's reasonable. I personally don't, I very rarely start it in my practice. I very rarely use it as a sedative. The way in which I will use it sometimes is as a time setter. So at a much lower dose than many people are taking it, normally kind of 1 milligram or less, and timed much earlier, because that is more in keeping with how melatonin actually is kind of naturally produced. As I mentioned, that 3 to 5 hours before bedtime, it starts to rise then, and then triggers sleep 3 to 5 hours later. And so I will sometimes incorporate that into other non-medication strategies for advancing the clock. Okay, or really that's the main reason why I'll use it. Having said that, some people really benefit from melatonin. So if I have people who I haven't seen before and they come in and they tell me that melatonin has been very beneficial, I don't discourage them from using it, although I do try to balance out the conversation. So I think there is, the general messaging around melatonin is that it's benign and it's natural. And, I start to get worried when I see people who are taking it at doses of 10 milligrams higher. Sometimes I've seen people take it at 60 milligrams. And I think, people need to remember it's a hormone. And so although there has been, studies to show short-term safety, we don't really know about the long-term effects. We do know that melatonin can impact things like the immune system, the reproductive system. Exactly what that impact is, I don't know that we really know. So I think it's a matter of, as with many things, balancing out the potential benefits with the downsides. And I think just unfortunately, oftentimes people don't really know about the potential downsides of melatonin. I think the other thing that's really important for people to know is that it's not regulated, right? So unlike medications, for example, melatonin that you get in pharmacies over the counter, it's not regulated, and also the dosing can be very, very different based on the brand. So, I think that's just another thing to add to the conversation around melatonin.
So I'd say, I mean, just to put a caveat that anybody who's considering melatonin should definitely go talk to their medical practitioner, because we're just providing general information here, but it's a conversation that you should discuss in further detail with whoever is prescribing to your child. So you mentioned your program a couple of times. You mentioned that you have a CBTI program. Would you want to tell us a bit more about that? And
Sure. Yeah. So I have been working with teens with insomnia for probably, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years, pretty much since I finished my training. And as I've mentioned, CBTI, I may not have mentioned this actually, but CBTI is a fantastic treatment. A lot of people don't know about it, but it works very well. It is a first line treatment for insomnia. It's also fairly short. So if people know about CBT, oftentimes people know about it for mood and anxiety, and a typical course of that might be 12, 20 sessions, right? But for insomnia, a typical course of treatment is 4 sessions, and you can see improvement. The fastest I've seen it is after week 1, but normally you see improvement maybe by week 2 or week 3, and the improvement can be pretty incredible. So it's a great treatment. However, oftentimes, because of all of those other challenges that I mentioned in the teen years, um, oftentimes I find it's very difficult for teens to access the traditional CBT, the kind of the way that it's delivered traditionally. And then there's also the parent component that's so important. So over the years, I've been kind of tweaking how I deliver things, and I have recently put together a program, which is actually an online program, but then there's also support for both the parents as well as for the teens. This is all virtual, but it's group support for both the parents and the teens. And it is based on CBTI, but I've also incorporated a lot of acceptance and commitment therapy strategies, because I really love that therapy, and I think a lot of it really works well with teens. And then there's a lot more around building the skills and, building the habits ahead of time that I think is not, it's touched on in CBTI, but it's not so explicitly focused on. And I think teens really need that extra support. So it is a program that I'm in the midst of piloting right now. I have a very small group of teens and their parents who are doing the program and really helping me to refine it and hopefully get it to the point where it's going to be very helpful. And it is something that I'm hoping to run the next cohort in May. But before that, I will likely make a version of it available that's just the online program. And then I'm actually running the program in what I call sprints, so that people are doing the treatment in a time limited period, but together in a group, which really does make a big difference. So it's still a little bit of work in progress. So that's why I'm still a bit uncertain on the timelines, but I do have a webinar that I'm giving regularly where I talk in a lot more detail about the program and how it maps onto those challenges that I commonly see in the teen years.
Great. That sounds like a really exciting program. I'm sure it's going to be very helpful to so many people. And so your website is decodeinsomnia.com?
Yeah. So I
Yes.
mean,
Okay.
everything I am doing should be kind of on there. I have a lot of
Mm-hmm.
resources, including that Jumpstart kit that I mentioned. I also have a 13 episode podcast series, just kind of short little podcast episodes where I go through a lot of a lot of information that I would give to my patients, but it's kind of for people to digest whenever they want. So that's called Find the Eight. And then I also have this Instagram account, so Decode Insomnia. And in a little while, I'm going to be putting out another podcast, but that's more meant for the parents and other professionals working with teens. And that one's actually called Meet the Eight.
Okay. Wow, you've got so much going on, and it sounds like there's so much help available for insomnia. That's great. Thank you so much. So we're going to be continuing our ADHD series over the next couple of weeks. So watch out for information, leaflets on an upcoming webinar, upcoming live videos, and also, keep following us on St. John Cap for information about ADHD and other mental health disorders. Before I let you go, Dr. Ooi, have you got any last minute advice or tips for us that adults can even benefit from as well?
I think what I'd like to say is that I very often I meet with people who have the belief, whether it's kind of not so at the surface or not, that sleep is just getting better is just not possible, right? That's a very actually common barrier that I see. Like, I've just never been able to sleep well, so it's just not possible. And I want, one of my missions is just to dispel that myth. We have really fantastic treatments. Oftentimes, I think it's about how advice has been delivered. I think, I often say to people that sleep hygiene handouts, although they're very well meaning, can actually be harmful because it's just too much to do and it's not giving the roadmap. So I think, I want to give people some hope that I have seen people who have struggled for decades, because I do some part of my practice, I do see some adults. And we have very good strategies. It's about being able to access them in a way that is digestible and doable and actionable and all that.
Great. Thank you very much. It was really good, a pleasure to have you here today. And hopefully I can bring you back again to talk in further detail about, your program and, the CBTI that you're going to be doing with these teams. If you're watching this as a replay, please just comment #replay so we know that you ended up watching it. And this will be kind of saved onto my Instagram page. And I think Dr. Cara will also be able to have it on her Instagram page as well, so that you can watch a replay at whatever time. Right. Thank you very much. And I'm going to let you go now. Thank you. I can see I am Nalapo. I can see Nikki Oludipe, Pastor May, and I think there are a few other people up there. Okay. Thank you all for joining in, and see you again soon.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Dr. Cara. Bye-bye.
Thank you for having me. Take care. Bye.
Bye.